She gave 8 years. He gave her position away, so she sent one email. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old. I live in Austin, Texas, in a one-bedroom apartment that I painted myself because I couldn't afford to hire anyone when I moved in 6 years ago. The walls are this soft sage green that my mom helped me pick over FaceTime on a Tuesday night while she was still in her scrubs from her hospital shift. I remember she held up 2 paint swatches to her phone camera and said, "Claire, both of these look like a salad. Pick the one that makes you happy." I picked the darker one. I still love it. I'm telling you that detail because I want you to understand something about me before this story goes anywhere. I am not the kind of person who makes dramatic moves. I am not the kind of person who sends emails that change the direction of a company. I am not the kind of person who walks out of a room while people are still mid-sentence. I am the kind of person who stays late, who covers for colleagues when their kids are sick, who remembers everyone's coffee order, who fixes problems quietly and never asks for the credit, because I genuinely believed that good work spoke for itself. I believed that for 8 years. And then on a Tuesday afternoon in March, my boss called me into his office, told me the promotion I had been building toward for 3 years was going to someone else, and smiled at me the way people smile when they expect you to thank them for the news. I didn't thank him. I didn't cry either, though I wanted to. I went back to my desk. I opened my laptop, and I made a decision that I had never made in 8 years of working for a man who had taken more from me than I ever realized until the moment he handed my future to someone younger and cheaper and easier to control. If you've ever given everything to a job and watched someone else walk away with the reward, this story is for you. Stay with me until the end because what happened after I sent that email changed not just my career, but the way I understood my own worth. And before we go anywhere, if this opening already hit something in you, hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you're new here. I put everything into these stories and I want you here for all of them. Ring that bell so you never miss one. Now let's go all the way back to the beginning. I grew up in a small town called Marble Falls, Texas, about an hour west of Austin, in a house with 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a backyard that my dad mowed every Saturday morning whether it needed it or not. He was a man of routines. He woke up at 5, made his own lunch, drove 40 minutes to the manufacturing plant where he worked quality control for 23 years, and came home smelling like metal and coffee every single evening. My mom was a nurse. She worked the morning shift at a hospital in Burnett and the overnight shift whenever they needed someone, and someone was almost always needed. She was the kind of tired that settled into her bones by the time I was in middle school, the kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep, because it comes from carrying other people's pain for so long that you forget to put it down when you leave the building. We were not poor, but we were also not comfortable in the way that word gets used in movies. We were the family that bought store-brand cereal and name-brand shoes because my mom said feet mattered more than breakfast labels. We were the family that drove a van with a cracked dashboard for 9 years because fixing the crack was a luxury and getting where you needed to go was a necessity. We were the family where vacation meant driving to San Antonio to see my grandmother, who made tamales from scratch and let me sleep on her floral couch that smelled like lavender and something older that I've never been able to name. I was the first person in my immediate family to get a 4-year degree, not because my parents didn't value education. They valued it more than almost anything, but because life had not given them the runway mine gave me. My dad's father had pulled him out of school at 16 to work. My mom had started nursing school twice and stopped twice because money ran out and responsibilities didn't. So when I walked across that stage at the University of Texas at Austin in May of 2013 with a degree in business communications, my mom stood up in the bleachers before my name was even fully called. I know because I was watching for her. She was in a yellow blouse she had bought specifically for that day, standing with her arms raised like she was trying to reach me from 50 rows back. My dad sat next to her crying the way men cry when they don't want anyone to see it, with his face slightly turned and his jaw tight. I promised myself that day that I was going to make that moment worth something, not just for me, for them, For the sacrifice of the store brand cereal and the cracked dashboard and the double shifts and the tamale-smelling couch. I was going to build something. I was going to be the kind of professional that people respected, the kind that earned it. That promise was the foundation of every decision I made for the next 8 years. And it was also, if I'm being honest, the thing that made me so easy to take advantage of. Because when you need the job to mean something, when the job is connected to proving something to people who sacrificed everything for you, you will work harder than is reasonable. You will stay longer than is healthy. You will absorb unfairness with a smile because complaining feels like weakness and weakness feels like letting everyone down. I graduated into a tough job market. 2013 was not a disaster the way 2008 had been, but it was not easy either. I sent 64 applications in 4 months. I had 11 interviews. I received 2 offers. One was a marketing assistant position at a small agency in Dallas that paid $31,000 a year. The other was a junior client relations coordinator role at a mid-size consulting firm in Austin called Meridian Strategic Group. The pay was $34,000. The city was home. The commute was 20 minutes from the apartment I was sharing with 2 roommates near South Congress. I took the Meridian job on a Friday afternoon and cried in my car for 10 minutes not from sadness, but from the specific relief of a person who has been holding their breath for 4 months and finally lets it go. My manager was a man named David Hargrove. He was 51 years old, had been at Meridian for 16 years, and ran the client relations department with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. He wore the same style of quarter-zip sweater in 7 different colors and kept a framed photo of his boat on his desk next to a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Boss," which I think he genuinely believed was ironic. He shook my hand on my first day and said, "Claire, this department runs on relationships. You take care of the clients take care of the firm takes care of us. It's a simple system and the only way to break it is to stop caring." He said it like a speech he had given before, which he had. I didn't know that yet. I nodded and believed every word. That was 8 years, and 3 months before the Tuesday afternoon, he told me my promotion was going to someone else. I want you to understand those 8 years before we talk about that Tuesday, because the Tuesday only makes sense when you understand what came before it, and what came before it was everything. It was every Saturday morning I came in, because a client in a different time zone needed something, and I was the only one who knew their account well enough to handle it. It was every performance review where David said things like, "Claire is the backbone of this department," and "Claire's client retention numbers are the best we've seen in a decade," and "I don't know what we'd do without her," while simultaneously paying me a salary that had increased a total of 11% across 4 raises in 8 years. It was the Christmas party 3 years ago where he introduced me to the firm's managing director as our best-kept secret, and I had smiled and thought that sounded like a compliment instead of understanding, as I do now, that being a secret is the opposite of being recognized. It was the mentorship program I built from scratch in year 4, because David said we needed to improve junior staff retention, and I stayed late for 2 weeks designing it. And it became something the firm used in 3 other departments, and my name appeared in 0 of the internal announcements about it. It was the Thompson account. The account I saved in year 6 when the client was 3 weeks from walking out the door over a billing dispute that nobody had caught because nobody was paying attention the way I was paying attention. I caught it. I called the client myself on a Friday evening. I stayed on the phone for 90 minutes. I worked through the weekend building a revised proposal. I presented it Monday morning, and the client not only stayed, but expanded their contract by 40%. David sent me a GIF of a fist bump in our Slack channel. A GIF. 8 years, a GIF. But I kept going because I believed the system worked. I believed good work eventually got rewarded. I believed David saw me. I believed Meridian was the place where I was going to build the career my parents had made space for me to have. I was wrong about all of it. And the morning I found out just how wrong I had been was the morning everything changed. There had been a senior director position open in the client relations department for 7 months before David sat me down that Tuesday. It wasn't a surprise that the position existed. Senior Director of Client Relations had been a title I knew I was being groomed for, or at least I believed I was being groomed for, based on 3 years of David saying things like, "When you're in a more senior role, and you'd be perfect for leading this initiative once you step up, and I'm keeping you in mind for something bigger, Claire, just be patient." Patient. I had that word cross-stitched into my professional DNA by that point. Position had been formally posted internally in August. I applied in the first 48 hours. I put together the strongest application I had ever assembled. I pulled my Thompson account data. I quantified my client retention improvements. I documented the mentorship program. I wrote a 5-page strategic vision document for where I believed the department could go over the next 3 years with the right leadership structure. I had my friend Priya read it 3 times. I revised it twice. I submitted it feeling, for the first time in a long time, genuinely excited. David scheduled my interview for a Thursday in September. It lasted 45 minutes. I thought it went well. He asked about my vision for client relationships in a market that was shifting toward digital-first communication. I had a detailed answer. He asked how I would handle managing people who had been my peers. I had thought about that too and gave him an honest, specific response. He asked where I saw myself in 5 years. I said, "Here, but further along than I am today." He laughed. He said, "I appreciate your commitment." He walked me out and said he'd be in touch. I waited 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, I did not follow up more than once because I did not want to seem desperate. I did not ask colleagues what they had heard because I did not want to seem like I was politicking. I just worked. I handled my accounts. I covered for Marcus when his daughter had her tonsils out. I helped onboard a new junior coordinator named Becca who was fresh out of UT and reminded me of myself at 22, eager and slightly terrified and trying very hard not to show either. I thought about what I would do when I got the promotion. I had a list in the Notes app on my phone, small things. I was going to finally replace my desk chair. I was going to move to a slightly bigger apartment closer to the trail. I was going to call my dad and tell him the news and hear him get quiet in the way he got quiet when he was proud because my dad had never learned to say it loudly, but you could always hear it in the silence. 6 weeks passed. David asked me to come to his office at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday. I brought a notepad. I don't know why I brought a notepad. Some part of me thought there might be details to write down. Start dates, salary, next steps. I sat across from David in the chair that had always been too low relative to his desk, which I had never thought about before and suddenly couldn't stop noticing, and I set my notepad on my knee and I waited. He said, "Claire, I want to talk to you about the senior director position." I said, "Of course." He said, "We've made a decision." I nodded. He said, "We're going with Ryan." The room didn't make a sound. I heard the air conditioning click on somewhere above the ceiling tiles. I heard someone laugh in the hallway outside. I heard my own heartbeat doing something I couldn't quite describe, not fast exactly, just very present, very loud, very there. Ryan Keller was 27 years old. He had been at Meridian for 14 months. He had come in as a mid-level coordinator after 2 years at a smaller firm in Houston, and he was good at his job. I want to be honest about that. He was genuinely competent, but he had been at this company for 14 months. 14 months. I had been there for 8 years and 3 months. I said, "Ryan." David said, "Yes, he's shown a lot of initiative lately, and the managing partners felt he had the right energy for where the firm wants to go." Energy, that word. I have thought about that word approximately 400 times since that afternoon. Energy, 8 years of results, and the deciding factor was energy. I said, "Can I ask what specifically factored into the decision?" David shifted in his chair. He picked up his pen and set it back down. He said, "It's a combination of things, Claire, leadership presence, visibility, the way he's positioned himself with the partners. You're incredibly valuable to us, you know that, you're the backbone of this department." And there was that phrase again, backbone, the word they used for people they needed too much to promote because promoting them would mean replacing them, and replacing them would be inconvenient. I said, "So my work wasn't the issue." He said, "Your work is excellent. This was about fit for the next phase." I said, I see. He said, I hope you understand this doesn't change how much we value you. I said, I appreciate you telling me directly. He said something else. I don't remember what. I remember nodding. I remember standing up. I remember shaking his hand because that's what I had been trained to do: maintain composure, be professional, don't give them a reason to say you were difficult. I remember walking back to my desk and sitting down and opening my laptop and staring at the screen for 4 minutes without seeing anything on it. Then I opened my email. And I started to think. I wasn't angry yet. Anger came later in the car on the way home, at a red light on Lamar Boulevard where I sat through an entire green cycle because I couldn't make my foot move to the gas pedal. At that moment, sitting at my desk, I was something quieter than anger. I was clear. Completely, finally, terrifyingly clear. I had spent 8 years making David Hargrove's department run. I had built the client relationships that kept the revenue coming in. I had solved the problems that would have cost the firm accounts worth millions. I had trained the people around me, including, now that I thought about it, I had run 3 training sessions that Ryan Keller had attended in his first month. I had literally taught him how we handled clients at Meridian. And the firm had looked at all of that and decided that what they needed going forward was his energy. I closed my email without sending anything. I went home. I sat on my sage green apartment floor and I called my mom and I said, I didn't get it. And she said, oh, baby. And I cried for about 20 minutes and she stayed on the phone without saying much because she knew, the way moms know, that sometimes being heard is the only thing that helps. Then I stopped crying. I made pasta. I watched half an episode of a show I wasn't paying attention to, and I went to bed thinking about one thing. The client list. Here is something that nobody tells you when you start a career in client relations at a mid-size consulting firm in your 20s. The relationships are yours. Not in a legal sense. The contracts belong to the firm. The accounts belong to the firm. The revenue belongs to the firm. But the trust, the actual human trust that makes a client pick up the phone when you call instead of sending it to voicemail, the trust that makes them email you directly instead of going through the official channels, the trust that makes them renew a contract they were about to walk away from because they believe in the specific person handling their account and not just the company logo on the invoice. That trust is not something a firm can manufacture. It is something a person builds, one conversation at a time, over years. I had been building it for 8 years. I knew which clients preferred morning calls and which ones never responded before 11. I knew which ones wanted data-heavy updates and which ones got overwhelmed by numbers and needed the story first. I knew about wedding anniversaries and college tuitions and the one client who had just been diagnosed with something serious and was managing his business from a hospital waiting room some days and needed patience more than professionalism. I knew all of this because I had paid attention, because I had treated these people like people and not like revenue figures. And I also, over 8 years, had built something specific and deliberate that David Hargrove had always praised without fully understanding. I had my own communication system with the clients. It had started in year 2 as a personal efficiency tool. I was managing 32 accounts, and the firm's internal CRM was clunky and slow and never reflected the actual current status of a relationship the way I needed it to. So I built my own supplementary system, a spreadsheet that tracked not just the official account data but the informal relationship data, notes from calls, personal details the clients had shared, communication preferences, sensitivities. The real story of each relationship beneath the contract numbers. Over 8 years, that spreadsheet had grown into something significant. 412 active and former contacts, notes going back to 2014, email threads I had saved, direct cell numbers clients had given me personally, referral chains showing how one client had introduced me to another who had introduced me to a third. The entire invisible architecture of a department's relationship network, documented and organized by the person who had built it. Meridian didn't know this document existed in this form. They had their CRM. They assumed the CRM was complete. It was not. It was the official version. What I had was the real version. I want to be clear about something before I go further because I know what some of you are thinking. I'm not going to tell you I did something that crossed a legal or ethical line in a way that harmed the clients or broke laws. What I did was make a decision about my own professional future using information that I had personally created and personally gathered through my own relationships. The line between what a company owns and what a person has built is often blurrier than we're told. I had spoken to a lawyer friend of mine that night, casually, not as a formal consultation, about what I was considering. She had said, and I am paraphrasing, "The relationships themselves are yours. How you maintain them going forward is your choice. What you built to track them is your documentation of your own work. Just don't take anything that's stamped with the firm's name." I hadn't planned to. What I did was this. I spent 3 evenings, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of that same week, writing individual emails to the 22 clients I considered my closest professional relationships. Not cold emails, not mass emails, personal, specific, individual emails that referenced our actual history together. The Thompson account email mentioned the Friday evening call and the weekend proposal and the outcome. The Caldwell Industries email mentioned the conversation we'd had about his daughter's scholarship application and how I had sent him a resource on it because I remembered he had mentioned it. The Harrison Group email mentioned the inside joke we had developed over 2 years about the quarterly report that always arrived formatted wrong until I had personally redesigned the template. Each email said, in language that was professional and warm and completely honest, that I was in the process of exploring new opportunities, that I wanted them to know directly and personally before any official announcements were made, that I valued our working relationship enormously, and that I would keep them informed of my next steps. Each email included my personal email address and my personal cell phone number. I sent the first batch on a Saturday morning from my personal laptop using my personal email account. By Sunday evening, 16 of the 22 had replied. By Monday afternoon, I had 11 phone calls scheduled for that week. And on Monday evening, David Hargrove called my personal cell phone for the first time in 8 years. I was in the middle of reheating leftover Thai food when my phone screen lit up with David's name at 6:47 on a Monday evening. I stared at it for one full ring cycle. I knew what the call was about. I had known it was coming since Saturday morning when I sent the first email and watched the replies start filling my personal inbox. 16 out of 22 was a number that spoke clearly. These were not casual client relationships. These were relationships that people valued enough to reply to on a Saturday. They were relationships built on 8 years of specific, genuine, consistent human attention. David calling my personal number at 6:47 on a Monday told me that someone, probably the managing director, had figured out what was happening before I had even taken the next step. I let the call go to the 4th ring, not because I was playing games, because I needed one more second to decide how I was going to handle this. I thought about my mom on the phone the night I didn't get the promotion. I thought about my dad mowing the lawn every Saturday. I thought about the sage green walls I painted myself and the 412 names in my document and the 8 years of Saturday mornings and the gif of a fist bump. I answered. David said, "Claire." His voice had a quality I had never heard in it before in 8 years. Not quite panic, something adjacent to panic. Controlled urgency trying to sound like casual concern and not quite making it. I said, "Hi, David." He said, "I got a few calls today from some of our clients." I said, "Okay." He said, "They mentioned receiving emails from you, personal emails." I said, "Yes." He said, "Claire, I want to understand what's going on. If you're feeling frustrated about the promotion decision, I get that, I do, but reaching out to clients directly like this." I said, "I reached out to people I have professional relationships with to let them know I'm exploring new opportunities. Is there something wrong with that?" He paused. I heard him breathe. I heard what might have been him closing a door somewhere. He said, "Some of these clients are asking questions. They're asking about continuity. They're asking who's going to be managing their accounts." Harrison called the managing director directly. I said, "I imagine they have concerns." He said, Claire, I need to ask you directly. Are you planning to leave Meridian? I thought about the 8 years. I thought about the Thompson account and the mentorship program and the word backbone and the word energy and the 14 months and Ryan Keller and the GIF. I said, David. He said, yes. I said, I'm thinking. He went completely silent. That silence lasted, I counted, 11 seconds. 11 seconds of a man who had built his department on the invisible foundation of my work, suddenly understanding in real time what it would mean for that foundation to walk out the door. He said, what would it take? And that question, 4 words from a man who had never once in 8 years asked me what I needed before I asked myself, told me more than the promotion conversation had. That question was the confirmation of everything I had suspected and never allowed myself to fully believe. He had always known my value. He had simply calculated that I would stay regardless. I said, I'll need to think about that. He said, of course. Take the time you need. But Claire, I want you to know that the firm values you. I value you. And I think there's a conversation to be had here about your future at Meridian. I said, I appreciate that. He said, can we sit down tomorrow, first thing? I said, I'll be in at 9. He said, perfect. And Claire, please don't send any more emails tonight. I said, good night, David. I hung up. I ate my Thai food. It was cold again, but I didn't care. I sat at my kitchen table and I opened my notes app and I looked at the list I had made 3 months ago about what I was going to do when I got the promotion. The desk chair, the bigger apartment, the call to my dad. I deleted the list. I opened a new note and I started writing a different one. Because the next morning's meeting was not going to be about whether I stayed at Meridian. It was going to be about something much more important than that. It was going to be about who had the power in that room and who had always had it and who was only now figuring that out. David had asked me to come in at 9. I arrived at 8:52, which was my normal time, because showing up at 9 sharp would have felt theatrical and I was not interested in theater. I was interested in clarity. I had spent Sunday evening and Monday evening after David's call preparing for this meeting with the same attention I had given to the Thompson account, the mentorship program, and every performance review. I had pulled every documented achievement I could quantify. Revenue retained through my direct intervention. Client satisfaction scores on accounts I managed versus accounts managed by others in the department. Referrals generated through my personal relationships with clients. The full financial value of the Thompson account expansion alone. I had also done something I had never done before in 8 years. I had called 2 people. The first was my friend Priya, who was a recruiter at a talent firm that placed senior-level professionals in business development and client relations roles. I had called her Saturday evening after I sent the emails. She had been, to put it simply, very interested in what I was telling her. She had 3 companies she wanted to introduce me to. She said the words, "Your profile is extremely strong, and this market is hungry for exactly what you have," with a directness that made my chest do something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something that felt like being seen. The second call was to Kevin Marsh, the managing director at a firm called Apex Consulting Group that I had heard about through 2 different industry contacts over the past year. They were growing. They were known for promoting from within. They had reached out to me twice through LinkedIn in the past 18 months, and I had not responded because I was being loyal to Meridian. I responded Saturday night. Kevin called me back Sunday morning. We talked for an hour. He said things that David Hargrove had never said to me in 8 years of employment. He said things like, "We'd want you in a senior leadership role from day one, and your client retention numbers are exactly the kind of track record we look for, and what would it take to make this a real conversation?" He asked what I needed. He asked about my priorities. He asked about my timeline. I went into Monday morning's meeting at Meridian with 2 things David didn't know I had. A competing interest that was real and not hypothetical, and the specific, grounded knowledge of what I was actually worth in the market. David was already in his office when I arrived. The managing director, a woman named Sandra Cho, who I had met approximately 6 times in 8 years, was sitting in the chair across from David's desk. That detail landed with weight. Sandra being in the room meant this had escalated above David's pay grade. It meant the client calls had created a real operational concern at the partner level. Sandra stood and extended her hand. She said, "Claire, thank you for coming in. I wanted to be part of this conversation." I sat down. I set my folder on my knee. I said, "I appreciate that." David started with the prepared version of what he had said on the phone the night before. "The firm values you. Your contributions are essential. The promotion decision was difficult, and perhaps the communication around it could have been handled better." He used the phrase, "going forward," 4 times in 3 minutes. I let him finish. Then Sandra said, "Claire, we'd like to talk about what it looks like for you to stay at Meridian, and for us to acknowledge your contributions in a way that's more commensurate with your role." I said, "I'd like to hear that." What followed was the most surreal 20 minutes of my professional life. Because in those 20 minutes, Sandra and David outlined an offer that included a new title, Senior Client Relations Manager. Not the director title, but senior, a salary increase of 18%, a performance bonus structure tied to client retention, and something called a key person retention agreement that included a signing bonus. An 18% raise, after 8 years of 11% total. A signing bonus to stay at the job I already had. I sat with a very still face, and I thought about the GIF. I said, "I appreciate this. I want to be honest with you both. I have had a conversation with another firm this week that is at a fairly advanced stage." Sandra's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. She said, "How advanced?" I said, "Advanced enough that I owe them a response by end of week." David said, "Claire, we can." And Sandra held up one hand slightly, a subtle gesture, and he stopped. Sandra said, "What would it take for Meridian to be your answer?" There it was again, the question nobody had thought to ask for 8 years. I opened my folder. I had made the list Sunday night. Not the list from my notes app about the desk chair and the bigger apartment and the call to my dad. A different list, a professional list. A list that I had written by first writing down everything I had contributed to Meridian over 8 years in specific dollar amounts and retention percentages and documented outcomes, and then cross-referencing it with what Priya and Kevin had told me the market valued for someone with my profile, and then adding one more category that no one had mentioned to me, but that I had decided mattered as much as the salary. I said, "I want to share something with you both before I respond to the offer you've outlined." I slid 2 pages across the desk, one for David, one for Sandra. It was a 1-page summary I had prepared, not a grievance document, not an emotional statement, a clean, factual business framing document that showed, in straightforward terms, the revenue impact of my work over the previous 8 years. Thompson account retention and expansion, client renewal rate on my accounts versus department average, referral revenue traced back to my direct relationships, the 3 training sessions I had run that are now standard department onboarding, the mentorship program, with a note that it had been implemented across 3 additional departments with no attribution to its origin. Sandra read it. David read it. Neither of them spoke for approximately 15 seconds. Then Sandra looked up and said, "This is comprehensive." I said, "I wanted you to have the full picture." David said, "Claire, we've always valued." I said, "I know you've said that. I wanted to show you what the value actually looks like in numbers." Sandra set the page down and looked at me directly. I had always respected Sandra from a distance. Up close, she was the kind of woman who made decisions without performing the process of making them. She looked at me, and I could see her doing the math in real time. Not the math of what I was worth. The math of what it would cost to lose me now that the clients had already started asking questions. I said, "Here's what I'm looking for." I laid it out. The senior director title, not the modified manager title in the counteroffer. The actual director title that the position had been posted at. A salary that reflected the market rate Priya had quoted me, which was 31% above what I was currently making. A seat at the department strategy table, meaning inclusion in quarterly partner meetings that affected client relations decisions. A written acknowledgement in my employment agreement that I was the lead relationship manager for the accounts I had built, meaning my departure would require a structured transition, period, and client communication that I would be part of. And an apology, not a formal one, not a written statement. A verbal, direct, human acknowledgement from David that the promotion process had not been conducted fairly. The last item made David look at the surface of his desk. Sandra said, "Give us a moment." She looked at David. A look passed between them that I couldn't fully read, but that was clearly a full conversation compressed into 3 seconds. She turned back to me and said, "Step out for just a few minutes, Claire. Get a coffee. We'll get you back in shortly." I stood. I walked to the break room. I poured coffee I didn't drink. I stood at the window and looked at the Austin skyline, and I thought about my dad mowing the lawn every Saturday, whether it needed it or not. I thought about the word routine, about showing up, about doing the work because it's the right thing to do and believing that eventually the right thing recognizes itself. The assistant knocked on the break room door at 11 minutes past when Sandra and David had sent me out. She said, "They're ready for you." I walked back in. David was standing. That was the first difference. He had been seated both times before. He was standing near the window with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into something I had genuinely never seen on him in 8 years. Not quite humility. The close neighbor of humility that a proud person arrives at when they have no remaining alternative. He said, "Claire." I said, "Yes." He said, "I owe you an apology." The room was quiet enough that I could hear the air conditioning again. He said, "The promotion process should have gone differently. You were the strongest candidate. The decision that was made was influenced by factors that had nothing to do with your work, and that was wrong, and I should have pushed back harder than I did." I said, "Thank you for saying that." He said, "I mean it." I believed him, not because he was a changed man, because he was a man who had just understood the cost of what he had done and was doing the only thing left that made practical sense. But I also believed the words themselves were true. I had been the strongest candidate. The factors that influenced the decision away from me were ones I knew and had felt for years without ever naming them. Youth, visibility. The easy confidence of a young man who walked into rooms like he expected them to rearrange for him. Energy. Sandra outlined the revised offer. It included everything I had asked for: the title, the salary, the strategy table, the transition language, all of it. I said, "I need 24 hours. She said, "Of course." I went back to my desk. I sat down. I opened my laptop. And I thought about Kevin Marsh and what he had said Sunday morning. And I thought about Priya. And I thought about what it would mean to stay in a place that had needed to lose me before it could see me. 24 hours is a long time when the answer is already forming, before the question is fully asked. I went home Monday evening, and I did something I had not done in a long time. I didn't open my laptop. I didn't review the offer documents. I didn't call Priya or text Kevin. I cooked dinner, actually cooked, not reheated. Pasta with a sauce I made from scratch because cooking from scratch was something I had learned from my grandmother in San Antonio, and it was the thing I did when I needed my hands to be busy while my brain worked without being watched. I thought about the offer Meridian had made. I thought about it the way you think about a house you're considering buying. You walk through every room. You open the closets. You look at the foundation. You try to imagine yourself living there in 5 years. Not in the best version of 5 years. In the ordinary version, in the Tuesday evening version, in the version where you're tired and it's raining and you just want the place you work to feel like somewhere that actually knows who you are. The Meridian offer was real. The title was real. The salary was real. The apology, whatever its limits, was real. And it was possible, genuinely possible, that the conversation we'd had that morning had shifted something in the way Sandra and David understood my value. It was possible that this was the version of Meridian I had been trying to build toward for 8 years finally arriving. But There is always a but when you're honest with yourself in a quiet kitchen over pasta you made from scratch. The but was this: they had not seen me until I made them. 8 years of the strongest client retention numbers in the department. 8 years of the backbone comment and the world's okayest boss mug and the gif. 8 years of being essential in private and invisible in public. And the thing that had made them finally see me was not my work. It was the moment my work started walking toward the door. I thought about what it would feel like to walk into that office for the next 8 years knowing that the moment I stopped being a potential loss was the moment I became worth fighting for. I thought about Ryan Keller sitting in the director's office that had been meant for me, and whether I could walk past that door every morning and feel okay. I thought about the next promotion cycle, and whether the lesson they had learned was the one that would stick, or whether it would fade the way most lessons do, when the urgency goes away. I called Kevin Marsh at 9:15 that evening. We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, Apex Consulting Group had made me an offer. Senior Director of Client Relations, the title that Meridian had dangled and redirected. A salary that was 38% above my current Meridian pay. A direct reporting line to the managing partner. A stated expectation that I would build and lead my own team within the first year. A welcome package that included a written commitment to the professional development budget and the promotion timeline. I asked Kevin one question before I said yes. I said, "Why do you want me specifically? Not my numbers, why me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because the clients you emailed last weekend replied to you on a Saturday. That doesn't happen because someone does their job well. That happens because someone made the people feel like they mattered. That's the thing we can't manufacture. That's you." I said, "I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning." I hung up and I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, and I thought about my mom in her yellow blouse with her arms raised. I thought about what I was going to tell her. I thought about what I was going to tell my dad. I thought about the sage green walls. Then I opened my notes app, and I started a new list. The next morning, I arrived at Meridian at 8:52, normal time. I went to my desk. I typed 2 resignation letters, 1 formal HR version, 1 personal version addressed to David. I printed them. I walked to his office. He was already at his desk. I set both letters on his desk. He looked at them. He looked at me. He said, "Claire." I said, "David." He said, "You're sure?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Is this about the offer? Because we can." I said, "It's not about the offer." He said, "Then what?" I said, "It's about the 8 years before the offer." He was quiet. I said, "I appreciate the apology. I appreciate everything you said yesterday. I'm choosing to take what I built here somewhere that saw it before it almost left." He didn't say anything else. I went back to my desk. I began the process of documenting my transition materials, the official ones, the ones that would help whoever came after me, because that was who I was, and that was not going to change regardless of how this story ended. I was professional until the last moment because professionalism had never been the problem. The problem had been that professionalism had been mistaken for compliance. The office heard the news by 10 o'clock. I know because people started appearing at my desk with the specific expression of people who have heard something that disrupts their sense of how things work. Marcus came over and said, "Is it true?" I said yes. He said, "Good for you," and looked slightly guilty when he said it, which told me that he had known more about the promotion process than he had ever told me. And I let that go because letting it go was the right thing, and I was still, even now, the person who did the right thing. David's assistant stopped by at 11 and handed me a note, handwritten. From David, it said, "I hope wherever you go next knows what they have." I folded it and put it in my bag. I left at 4 o'clock on a Thursday, 2 weeks before my formal last day, because they asked me to help with the transition, and I honored that. I carried 1 box. It was lighter than I expected. 8 years of professional life, and it fit in 1 box. I sat in my car, and I called my mom. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Mom, I got a promotion." She said, "Oh, baby," the same 2 words, but different this time. My first day at Apex Consulting Group was a Monday in April, and the thing I remember most about it is that Kevin Marsh met me in the lobby. Not his assistant, not an HR coordinator. The managing partner himself in a regular button-down, no tie, coffee in hand, standing in the lobby at 8:45 when I walked through the door and saying, "Good morning, Claire. How was your commute?" That's it. That's the detail. The managing partner of the firm I just joined was standing in the lobby asking about my commute. It is such a small thing that I'm slightly embarrassed by how much it meant to me. But after 8 years of a boss who communicated primarily through Slack GIFs and quarterly reviews, the basic human act of a leader being present at the beginning of something mattered in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Kevin walked me through the office himself, not a tour designed to impress. A real tour, the kind where he said, "This is where the printer jams, the third tray specifically. Don't even try the third tray. And the Thai place 2 blocks over is what everyone orders on late nights. The green curry is the right call. And the person you most need to know before anyone else is Diane at the front desk, because Diane knows where everything is, and more importantly, she knows everything." He introduced me to my team. My team. 4 people who were going to report to me and who were, I could see in the first 10 minutes, good at their jobs and not entirely sure yet what to make of the new senior director walking through the door. I understood that. I had been on that side of a new manager's arrival, and I remembered the specific waiting quality of those first few days, the calibrating. The figuring out who this person actually was, beneath whatever impression they were trying to make. I said very little in the first team meeting. I introduced myself. I gave them the honest version. I told them I had spent 8 years doing client relations at a firm that taught me what worked and what didn't work in building genuine professional relationships. I told them that I wasn't coming in to change everything because I didn't know enough yet to know what needed changing. I told them I was going to spend my first month listening more than talking. I told them my door was going to be open and that I meant the door literally, not as a corporate metaphor. I was physically going to keep my office door open. One of them, a woman named Jess, who turned out to be the best reader of people I have ever worked with, looked at me after that introduction with an expression that I recognized from the outside for the first time. It was the same expression I used to have in my 20s when a manager said something that sounded like they actually meant it. The expression of cautious hope, the trying to believe without getting burned again. I made a private note to never give Jess or anyone on my team a reason to stop hopping. That first week I met 14 clients. Some were existing Apex relationships. 2 were people I had reached out to during my transition from Meridian who had expressed interest in following me. The calls felt different from anything I had experienced in years. Not because the conversations were different. They were the same kinds of conversations I had always had: relationship building, account check-ins, problem solving. They felt different because I was having them as the director. As the person in the room with the authority to make decisions and commitments, rather than as the person who had to bring everything back to a manager for approval. I made a commitment on the second day of my first week that I could not have made at Meridian. A client called with a concern about a project timeline. At Meridian, I would have said, "Let me look into that and get back to you." At Apex, I said, "I'm going to look at this with you right now, and we'll figure out a path forward before we hang up." We figured it out in 40 minutes. The client said, "That was the fastest resolution I've had at any firm I've worked with." I said, "I hope it's the standard you get from us every time." I hung up and sat with that for a moment. That feeling of being able to just handle something, of having the authority to match the responsibility, of the ceiling being gone. On Friday evening of my first week, Kevin stopped by my office at 5:30 and said, "How was week 1?" I said, "It was the best work week I've had in years." He said, "Good. That should be the floor, not the ceiling." I said, "I agree." He said, "You have a team that was waiting for someone to actually lead them. I think they can see that's what they've got now." I drove home that Friday evening with the windows down even though it was still slightly cold because I wanted to feel the air. I called my mom. I called my dad. My dad answered on the 3rd ring and I told him about the week. I told him about Kevin in the lobby. I told him about Jess and her expression. I told him about the 40-minute client call that ended in a solution. He was quiet for a moment in the way. He was always quiet when he was listening to something that mattered. Then he said, "Are you happy?" I said, "Yeah, Dad, I'm really happy." He said, "Good." And then he said something he almost never said out loud. He said, "I'm proud of you, Claire." I sat in my car in the parking garage of my apartment building, and I cried for about 3 minutes. Good crying. The kind that happens when something you have been working toward for a long time finally arrives, and you let yourself feel the full weight of having gotten there. Then I went upstairs. I looked at my sage green walls. I ordered Thai food. I sat on my kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, and I opened my notes app. New list. I want to be honest about something before I tell you this part. I did not spend a lot of time thinking about what happened at Meridian after I left. Not because I was above it, because I was busy. Genuinely, productively, happily busy in a way I had not been in years. I was building something that was mine in a way the Meridian work had never quite been, and the building required my full attention. But I live in Austin, and the consulting world in Austin is not large, and news travels the way news travels in industries where everyone knows the same people. I heard things, not because I sought them out, because they arrived. The first thing I heard was from Priya, about 3 weeks after I left. She was still in contact with a few people at Meridian through her recruiting work. She told me that 3 of the 22 clients I had emailed had formally requested to be transitioned to my new firm. Technically, they were bound by existing contracts for the immediate term, but they had made their preference known through the proper channels, and Meridian's management was apparently very aware of the request. 3 clients doesn't sound like many, but when you account for the contract values involved and the referral networks attached to those clients, 3 is not a small number. It was the kind of number that makes finance people look uncomfortable in meetings. The second thing I heard was about Ryan. I want to be careful here because I don't know Ryan Keller's full story, and I don't want to be unfair to a person I never actually had a problem with. He got a promotion he maybe should not have gotten at the expense of someone who had worked longer and harder. That was David's failure more than Ryan's. Ryan didn't decide to give himself the job. But here is what I heard. The director role was harder than Ryan had expected, not because Ryan wasn't capable, because the role depended enormously on client relationships that had been built by the person who was no longer there. My documentation of those relationships, the real documentation, the one with the personal notes and the communication preferences and the 412 contacts, had walked out the door with me. The official CRM was a skeleton of what I had maintained. And the clients felt the difference. I heard that Ryan had a difficult first quarter, that 2 accounts that had been considered stable had flagged concerns with their relationship management, that the quarterly client satisfaction scores had dropped measurably for the first time in 4 years, that David had been in several meetings with Sandra about the situation. I did not feel triumphant about this. I felt something quieter, something closer to sad, because it was preventable, all of it. The choice that led to Ryan being in over his head was the same choice that led to my promotion being rerouted. It was the choice to prioritize appearance over substance, to value the impression of leadership over the reality of it. And when you make that choice, the consequences tend to arrive not in one dramatic moment, but in the slow erosion of the things that were actually holding everything together. David sent me a LinkedIn message in June. 3 months after I left, it said, "I hope you're doing well. You built something significant here and I didn't always acknowledge it the way I should have. I hope you know I'm proud of what you've accomplished." I read it. I typed a response. I deleted it. I typed a shorter one. I deleted that too. I closed the app and made coffee and thought about it for a day. Then I sent one line. It said, "Thank you for saying that. I wish you well." That was all. Some conversations don't need more than that. Some chapters close better with a period than with a paragraph. The third thing I heard came from Sandra, actually, directly. She called my cell 6 months after I left. She was calling to ask, professionally, whether I would be open to a consulting arrangement with Meridian on a project basis for a specific client account that had become complicated. It was the kind of call that represented something significant. It represented an institution that had undervalued me for 8 years, acknowledging, in the clearest possible way, that it still needed what I had. I said, "I appreciate you reaching out, Sandra. I'm not available for consulting work with Meridian at this time, but I wish the team well." She said, "I understand. For what it's worth, Claire, the way you handled the transition, everything you did, it showed a lot of class." I said, "Thank you, Sandra." She said, "I hope Apex knows what they have." I said, "They seem to." We hung up. I went back to my desk, and I worked on the expansion proposal I was building for Kevin's review. The proposal was for a new client segment that I had identified through relationships I had cultivated in my first 8 months at Apex. It was, according to Kevin's preliminary review, the most detailed and well-researched proposal the firm had received from an internal team in 3 years. I had a meeting with Kevin the following morning to walk through it. I set my alarm for 7:15, normal time. 8 years is a long time to spend in a place that sees you as a ceiling and not a floor. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it as plainly and honestly as I know how, because I think a lot of people are sitting where I sat for most of those 8 years, doing the work, believing in the system, waiting for the recognition to arrive on its own. And I want to say something true to those people before this story ends. The recognition does not always arrive on its own. This is the thing nobody tells you when you're 22 and you're starting your first real job and you're full of the promise you made yourself at graduation. They tell you that hard work pays off. They tell you that quality speaks for itself. They tell you that if you show up, do your job, be reliable, be excellent, eventually the right people will notice. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes the right people are very comfortable with you exactly where you are. Sometimes being excellent at your current level is the thing that makes you most useful to the people who benefit from you staying at your current level. Sometimes the backbone comment is not a stepping stone to a promotion. Sometimes it's a management strategy for keeping the load-bearing wall exactly where it is. I'm not saying that every employer is like David Hargrove. I am saying that the warning signs were there for years, and I chose not to read them because reading them would have required me to act on them, and acting on them felt like too much risk. What if I was wrong? What if I rocked the boat and lost the stability I had worked so hard to build? What if the system really was going to reward me eventually, and I just needed more patience? That word again, patience. Here is what I understand now about patience in a professional context. Patience is a virtue when you are building something. Patience is a liability when you are waiting for someone else to give you what you have already earned. There is a specific kind of professional patience that we teach people, particularly women, particularly people who are the first in their family to reach a certain level of professional achievement, that is not actually patience at all. It is silence dressed up as a virtue. It is the willingness to absorb unfairness quietly reframed as professionalism. I absorbed a lot. For 8 years, I was very professional. What I wish I had understood sooner is that documenting your value is not arrogant. Knowing your market worth is not greedy. Understanding what you have built and who benefits from it is not disloyal. Having a conversation with a recruiter before you need to is not disloyalty. Exploring your options before an ultimatum forces you to is not betrayal. These things are called awareness. And awareness is the thing that eventually lets you make a decision from a place of power rather than desperation. I made the decision to send those emails from a place of clarity, not desperation. I had the documentation because I had always kept good records of my own work. I had the relationships because I had invested in people genuinely and consistently. I had options because I had stayed engaged with my professional network even when I felt most certain I would never need it. None of those things happened overnight, but they were available to me because I had, without entirely realizing it, been building the infrastructure of my own independence alongside the work I was doing for Meridian. I just had not yet activated it. The moment I activated it, everything changed. Not because I became someone different, because I let myself be fully seen as who I had always been. That is the thing I want to leave you with, not the email, not the 2 words, Not the job offer or the resignation or the phone call in the lobby on my first day at Apex. Those are events. Events are not the story. The story is this. There is a version of you that has been showing up, doing the work, being excellent, and absorbing the quiet unfairness of being valued for your output without being recognized for your identity. That version of you has been building something for a long time. The question is whether you are going to stay in a place that only sees what you've built when it's walking toward the exit, or whether you are going to take what you've built somewhere that sees it clearly from the very first day. I couldn't answer that question for 8 years. I answered it on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when a man smiled at me after giving my future to someone else and waited for me to thank him. I didn't thank him. I went home, made pasta, and started making a different kind of list. I am 12 months into a role that feels, for the first time in my professional life, like the right size. Not comfortable in a way that makes me stop growing. Right-sized in a way that lets me grow without a ceiling cutting me off. My team is good. Jess turned out to be exactly as sharp as I thought she was on day one. The Thompson-equivalent client relationships I've built at Apex in 1 year are already stronger than anything I had at Meridian at the 3-year mark. The expansion proposal got approved. We're hearing 2 new coordinators this quarter. I get to be part of that. I got a new desk chair in November. Dark gray, adjustable armrests, the kind that actually supports your back when you've been on calls for 4 hours. It cost more than I would have spent on it a year ago, and I sat in it on the first day and thought about the list in my notes app. I called my mom on a Sunday. She was just home from her shift, still in her scrubs, making tea. She asked how work was. I told her it was good, really good. She said I knew it would be with the specific certainty of a woman who believed in me before I believed in myself. I called my dad. He asked if I was still happy. I said yes. He said good. He mowed his lawn that Saturday. He'll mow it next Saturday too, rain or shine, needed or not. Some people show up. Some people stop waiting for permission to be recognized and start documenting their own value and knowing their own worth and moving toward the places that see them clearly. Both are forms of showing up. One just takes a little longer to learn. If this story hit something real in you, if you're the person still sitting at the desk with the GIF on your screen wondering when your 8 years are going to count, please hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells me this kind of story is worth telling. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I put real stories here. Stories about real decisions that real people make when they finally decide that being the backbone of someone else's success is not the same as building their own. Ring the bell so you're here for the next one. And if there's someone in your life who needs to hear this story today, somebody who's been patient too long with the wrong people, send it to them. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone you love is show them that walking out the door is not the end of something. It's the beginning of everything. Take care of yourselves out there. See you next time.